Leroy Davis had spent most of his life drifting along the dilapidated streets of Bricksdale, a grimy urban neighborhood where boarded-up row houses stood like wailing ghosts of a better but long-forgotten past. Leroy was smart, and most people would say that he was too smart for his own good. Leroy used his intellect and street smarts to wheel and deal, trying to carve out a future beyond the potholed roads and flickering streetlights of Bricksdale. His best friend Lamar Jenkins had grown up just 2 blocks over, surviving in the same concrete jungle. Lamar had a kind heart hidden beneath a tough exterior, and he was known to be a decent fighter when provoked, and he had a talent for finding humor in even the bleakest situations. They were both used to the danger that was lurking around every corner of Bricksdale, but neither expected that this danger would find them so suddenly and so brutally. One bitterly cold night, Leroy and Lamar found themselves huddling behind a dumpster in a narrow alley strewn with broken glass. They had been following a lead, one that Lamar swore would set them up for good if the intel turned out right. Instead, everything went horribly sideways in a heartbeat. Angry shouts echoed off the graffitied walls, and as the flashlights approached, they revealed jittery hands gripping guns and faces that showed anger, fear, and uncertainty. Then, a couple of seconds later, muzzle flashes tore through the darkness as the sound of death echoed through the alleyway. The bullets found them tearing through their flesh, silent, cruel, and final. The last thing Leroy remembered was Lamar's terrified gasp as he crumpled to the ground. Now standing over their own, still warm, lifeless bodies, Leroy and Lamar stared at themselves in paralyzed horror. The cold radiating from their spectral forms clashed with the shock flooding their minds. Leroy fought the overwhelming confusion, fighting to catch a breath he no longer needed. Lamar's eyes were wide with dismay, flickering like an ember about to die out, until something changed, and they both felt it like an electric jolt through their ghostly veins. "Oh man, are we ghosts?" Lamar's voice trembled as he reached out, his fingers passing cleanly through a broken beer bottle. "Yeah, it kinda looks like we're dead," Leroy murmured, swallowing hard, though the action felt strangely hollow. "Why? Why did this happen to us? We can't just be dead." They drifted closer to their corpses, taking in every detail. The pooling blood, the vacant eyes, the gunshot wounds. Leroy fought back his tears, if it was possible for him to have any in his spectral form. They hadn't even known what had happened, or who had pulled the trigger. But they wouldn't rest, not until they found out who was responsible for taking their lives. That was when Leroy noticed the scrap of paper curled in his lifeless hand. With an uneasy chill coursing through him, he leaned down, and to his surprise, he pried the scrap of paper loose with his spectral hand from his body's stiffening fingers. Scrawled across the paper was a name: the Kingpin. "Who the hell is the Kingpin?" Lamar asked, voice thick with anger and disbelief. "I don't know, but we're damn well going to find out," Leroy whispered, his ghostly form trembling with rage. "Whoever or whatever the Kingpin is, they're the reason we're lying in this alley in a pool of our own blood, and I swear they're going to pay for it." Growing up, Leroy and Lamar had learned fast that the only way to survive Bricksdale was to stay sharp or get swallowed by the streets. Sometimes they hustled small jobs, sometimes they got entangled in bigger schemes, but they had never been killers. They tried to avoid the darkest corners of the criminal world, but apparently they had stumbled headlong into it without even realizing. Now, as they roamed the deserted alley in their translucent forms, the streetlights flickered dangerously, casting unearthly shadows against the graffiti of crowned skeletons and broken hearts. The alley itself seemed alive now. Metallic clanging from distant dumpsters rattled Leroy's soul. And then there was the smell, so much stronger in death than in life, an acrid stench of old urine, stale liquor, and rotting garbage. Yet, bizarrely, the sense of smell shouldn't have mattered to them anymore, but somehow, for some inexplicable reason, they were still connected to the physical world. They may have been ghosts, but they soon learned that they weren't completely helpless. Their discovery came in a flash of panic when Lamar tried to push aside a wooden crate blocking their path. His transparent hand sank into the wood as though it were water. Startled, he pulled back. Leroy frowned, eyes narrowed, and an idea was forming itself in his mind. "Check this out," Leroy said, stepping toward the high brick wall at the end of the alley. He pressed a hand against the surface and watched it pass through. "We can phase through things." Lamar let out an uneasy chuckle. "Remember all those horror movies we used to watch? Did we turn into the poltergeists that we always made fun of?" Leroy smiled and replied grimly, "Yeah, maybe we are, and if we are, let's use it to our advantage." They then began to test more of their ghostly abilities, and they found they could levitate themselves a few inches off the ground, though not gracefully. They also discovered that, with enough focus, they could move small objects, an empty soda can, a dropped wallet. It took a lot of concentration, and their energy waned quickly. But the worst or best part was that they still had their street smarts and cunning. They might be dead, but they were far from powerless. Venturing out of the alley, Leroy and Lamar drifted like silent nightmares towards a nearby rundown bar frequented by local hustlers and criminals. It was the kind of place with flickering neon signs, with a dirty pink glow that promised trouble inside. They slipped through the door, literally unseen by the two bouncers at the entrance. Music hammered through the speakers, pulsating with a bass line that vibrated the floor. In the gloom, Leroy spotted a familiar face. Big Carla, known around the neighborhood for her gossip and shady deals. She sat in a corner, sipping from a tumbler of cheap whiskey, her heavily lined eyes darting suspiciously from side to side, looking for her next mark or a possible problem. Leroy drifted over, gesturing for Lamar to follow. Neither of them could resist. Lamar concentrated hard, managing to move a stray napkin on the table. Big Carla startled, eyes darting around, scanning for the cause. Leroy fought a sinister grin as he used his powers to tilt her glass just enough to spill whiskey onto her lap. She jumped to her feet, cursing, but there was something else in her eyes. Fear. She must have felt their presence. Everyone in the bar turned to stare at her, wondering what was going on. "What in God's name?" Carla hissed, brushing the liquor off her tight skirt. She glanced around like she knew something was off. "Is someone messing with me?" Deep down, Leroy and Lamar felt the tingle of vengeance. They wanted answers, but they didn't want to reveal themselves. Not yet, not until they knew they were ready. Slipping back outside, Leroy found himself overwhelmed by fleeting memories. The times he and Lamar shared slices of pizza on the curb, laughing about the latest rumor. The times they defended each other in pointless street fights against neighborhood bullies. All those moments were gone now, overshadowed by the violent end they had met. A nauseous swirl of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak flooded through him. "We gotta find out who or what the Kingpin is," Leroy muttered, ignoring the trembling in his voice. "We owe it to ourselves to get revenge. No one just kills us and walks away." Lamar nodded slowly, staring at a flickering street lamp. "I'm with you, man. We'll hunt down this Kingpin, whoever or whatever they are, and we'll make them pay." As the night deepened, a fresh wave of horrors began creeping up on them. A long wail echoed through the empty streets like the shriek of tortured metal. They followed the sound, drawn to a scene of terrifying intensity. A group of tough-looking men was dragging someone away, presumably for a brutal beating or worse. Leroy and Lamar floated closer, unseen and unheard. The man's screams were cut short by a savage punch to the gut and the sharp, brutal sting of a cold, hard knife piercing flesh. Blood trickled onto the pavement, forming a sinister pattern under the street lamp. Leroy's fury ignited. The memory of their own murder flashed like lightning behind his eyes. Lamar's spectral form crackled with energy. With all the willpower they could muster, they flung a trash can through the air, sending it crashing into the assailants. Pandemonium broke out as the terrified men, now reduced to scared little boys, scattered, swearing they'd just seen a ghost. "You'd better run, you stinking cowards!" Lamar roared, his voice echoing eerily in the darkness. "This is just the beginning," Leroy added with a menacing whisper. But they couldn't save the victim. By the time the thugs fled, he was unconscious, barely clinging to life. The sight of fresh blood trickling between the cracks in the sidewalk forced Leroy to look away. There was a viciousness to Bricksdale they'd never fully understood while they were alive. Death had now pulled back the curtain, revealing the truly dark, sinister, unfiltered underbelly of their neighborhood. After wandering deeper into the night, sharing their thoughts on their current situation, they came across a shuttered gambling den, the rotted wooden door hidden under layers of graffiti and a single flickering bulb. Inside, a figure paced in the darkness. Drawing closer, Leroy and Lamar felt a wave of twisted recognition. The silhouette belonged to Marcus, a low-level street hustler they used to run with. Marcus was the guy that had the info on everything shady that happened in Bricksdale. He was on the phone, and his voice was low and urgent. "Yes, boss. I know they're dead," he whispered, oblivious to the two ghostly presences listening in. "Yes, that's right, the two punks, Leroy and Lamar. No, I ain't seen the papers, but I know it was a done deal. Look, I'm telling you, they got clipped by mistake." Yes, sir, Kingpin. "Of course. I'm loyal. No one suspects a thing." Lamar inhaled sharply, though he no longer needed air. "Marcus, that backstabbing snake." Leroy's hands shook, a spectral rage boiling through him. "He sold us out, that traitorous son of a skank." They watched as Marcus ended the call, then wiped the sweat from his forehead with trembling fingers. He must have realized the gravity of snuffing out two lives by mistake. Or maybe he was just terrified he'd be next. "We need to have a little talk with our old friend," Leroy hissed. Lamar sneered. "Oh, we definitely will." As they glided closer to Marcus, a sudden wave of cold that didn't belong to them swept through the room. The shadows warped unnaturally, twisting until a tall, hooded form emerged at Marcus's back. This figure wasn't human, and its visage was a gnarled contortion of bone, fetid flesh, and malevolence. Leroy and Lamar recoiled in shock and fear. Even in their spectral form, this thing made them fear for their ghostly lives. Marcus, sensing something, turned, only to scream at the sight of this unholy apparition. Before Leroy or Lamar could intervene, the entity swept a bony hand over Marcus's eyes. His scream became guttural and panicked. Flesh visibly melted from the hustler's face, leaving behind a mere echo of who he had been. Leroy and Lamar could only watch in a mixture of fear, horror, and twisted fascination as the monstrous figure ignored their presence and vanished into the shadows. For a moment, there was an eerie silence. Then Marcus's body collapsed in a heap, lifeless eyes staring wide, and on what was left of his face, he wore an expression of unspeakable terror. The reek of sulfur and rotting flesh clung to the air. Whatever that entity was, it sent an unmistakable warning. Leroy and Lamar weren't the only ghosts haunting Bricksdale tonight. "What the hell was that?" Lamar stammered, trembling. I don't know," Leroy whispered, dread flickering in his eyes. "But it's real bad news, whatever it was. And things are a whole lot worse than we ever imagined." Though the night's horrors weighed on them, Leroy and Lamar forced themselves to search Marcus's body for further clues. They needed answers, fast. Inside his jacket pocket, they found a second scrap of paper. This one bore the same ominous name, the Kingpin, along with an address of a warehouse down by the old docks, just outside of Bricksdale. Beside it was a crude sketch of a crowned skull, echoing the graffiti they'd seen in the alley. "So, he's real. The Kingpin is more than just a rumor," Lamar said shakily, glancing at the battered slip of paper. Yeah. And I'm guessing that demon we saw, it might be on the Kingpin's leash," Leroy added, voice low. "We got bigger problems than we thought." Despite their resolve, a thin veil of fear clung to them. Death had made them spectators of a hellish underworld they hadn't known existed. Now, they were determined to see it through, no matter how nightmarish it became. The only solace they had was each other, and the ghostly powers fueling their vengeful quest. They wouldn't stop until they faced the Kingpin, and discovered the truth behind this twisted new reality. In the distance, the city lights shimmered malevolently. Sirens howled like wounded animals. Leroy and Lamar shared a grim nod, slipping into the nearest shadow. Uncertainty loomed over them, but an unrelenting anger pushed them forward. Whatever awaited them at that old dock warehouse, they would face head-on. Being dead, they believed that they had nothing left to lose. Lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating the city's grim skyline. Leroy held the scrap of paper tight in his ghostly hand, his mind replaying Marcus's horrifying death. A slow, burning hatred filled him. He wasn't just out for revenge. He wanted the Kingpin to suffer, to understand the depths of their fury. Lamar, still shaking from the encounter, exhaled a whisper that echoed in the darkness. "We ain't done yet. We'll make sure the Kingpin knows we're coming." And so they drifted into the night, ghetto ghosts with an unholy mission, hungry for vengeance and haunted by revelations of an evil darker than the bullet-ridden streets they once walked. They knew the name, the Kingpin. Now they had an address, and the next stop on their otherworldly journey would be that foreboding warehouse by the docks, where the real terror and the next story of this journey awaited.